Hi, I'm Harper. When I was 16, my parents drove me deep into the Alabama backroads and left me at a rotting abandoned house. Not because they forgot me, not because they were lost. They did it on purpose to teach me a lesson. They wanted to see if I could survive, if I could find my way home. I never went back. But years later, they found me. Not out of love, not out of guilt, but because they needed something. And when I said no, they tried to destroy everything I built. But they didn't know I had already learned how to survive without them. It was one of those thick, sticky Alabama summers, the air heavy with heat and the sweet rotting scent of pine needles. The dirt road kicked up red dust as Dad's old Chevy rumbled over the gravel, the windows down the wind, pushing my hair into my eyes. Jack, my father, kept tapping the steering wheel, humming to the static of the radio, while Mom Marlene fanned herself with a crumpled church bulletin. We turned down a narrow path lined with tall grass and rusted fence posts. The truck slowed as a small leaning house came into view, hidden behind overgrown bushes. The windows were cracked, some boarded, and vines crawled up the sagging porch. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "Hop out, Harper," Dad said, not looking at me. I blinked, clutching the frayed strap of my backpack. "What? Why?" Mom turned around, forcing a smile that didn't reach her tired blue eyes. "Just go inside and grab that box by the door, honey. It's from an old friend." The engine idled, rumbling beneath me as I opened the creaky door and stepped onto the gravel. Heat shimmered off the hood, making the air dance. The moment I closed the door, Dad's window rolled down. His face was blank, his eyes hidden behind old aviator sunglasses. "Let's see how she finds her way home," he muttered loud enough for me to hear. Before I could open my mouth, the truck rolled forward, tires crunching over gravel, then sped up, kicking a cloud of red dust into the air. I coughed, waving a hand in front of my face, the outline of the truck growing smaller as it turned back onto the main road, leaving me standing there in the heat. I stood frozen for a moment, the buzzing of cicadas loud in my ears, the scent of dirt and dry grass filling my lungs. My fingers trembled as I pulled my phone from my pocket, but the screen glared up at me, service bars gone, nothing but the time blinking in the corner. I swallowed hard and turned toward the house. The wood on the porch was gray and splintered, nails sticking out like crooked teeth. I stepped carefully, the boards creaking under my weight, the heat of the sun beating down on the back of my neck. Inside, the smell of mildew and damp wood hit me like a slap. The air was heavy still, and I could hear a slow drip coming from somewhere deeper in the house. I looked around, eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through cracks in the boards. The wallpaper was peeling, revealing yellowed plaster underneath, and the floor was scattered with old leaves and dirt blown in by the wind. I didn't see any box by the door. A breeze pushed through a broken window, making a piece of wallpaper flap softly against the wall. I jumped at the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. I forced myself to take a breath, to step farther inside, the old floor groaning under each step. I glanced at the corners of the room, half expecting someone to jump out, but it was empty, silent, except for the drip and the groan of the old boards. Turning around, I pushed open the screen door, letting it creak and slap against the frame as I stepped back outside. I looked down the road where the truck had disappeared, hoping, praying that it would come back, that this was another twisted lesson that would end soon. But there was nothing. Just the hum of insects, the rustle of grass, and the soft creak of the porch as I sank down to sit on the top step, arms wrapping around my knees. The dirt road stretched ahead, empty and quiet, a thin line cutting through the heat and grass. I wiped sweat from my forehead with the back of my hand, glancing around the yard, spotting faint paw prints in the dry dirt leading around the side of the house. A breeze pushed past, carrying the scent of something wild and sharp, and I heard the distant groan of the wind moving through the old wood. I closed my eyes, pulling my knees tighter, the fear crawling up my spine as I tried to convince myself that they would come back, that they couldn't possibly leave me here alone. A sound broke through the silence, low and wet, like a heavy breath dragging across the floorboards behind me. I froze, my arms tightening around my knees, ears straining in the still air. Another breath, closer this time, followed by the soft tap of nails on wood. My eyes snapped open, scanning the porch, the dirt yard, the broken windows. Nothing moved, but the sound came again, steady, slow, alive. I forced myself to stand, legs shaking, palms sweaty against my jeans. I turned toward the side of the house where the sound was coming from, every instinct screaming to run. But I couldn't leave, not without knowing what was there, not without trying to stay in control. The breeze shifted, carrying the scent of damp fur and dirt. I stepped carefully down the creaking steps, the dry grass crunching under my shoes. The sun was dropping, lower shadows growing longer across the yard. I followed the faint prints in the dirt moving around the corner where the siding peeled away from the house. That's when I saw it. A dog, ribs showing under patchy brown fur, was crouched low near the foundation, eyes glinting gold in the fading light. It was staring right at me, hackles raised, lips twitching as if deciding whether to growl or run. I froze, heart hammering so hard it hurt. "Hey," I whispered, my voice shaking. "It's okay. I'm not gonna hurt you." The dog's ears twitched, but it didn't move, eyes locked on mine. Its breathing was ragged, each inhale sounding like a struggle, each exhale wheezing. I took a slow step forward, hands out, palms open. "Easy," I whispered again, "easy, buddy." It shifted weight, moving to its back legs, ready to bolt. I stopped, dropping to one knee in the dirt, ignoring the sharp rocks pressing into my skin. I pulled the crust of bread I had stuffed in my pocket that morning, holding it out toward the dog. "Here," I said softly. "You're hungry, right?" "Me too." The dog's nose twitched, sniffing the air. It inched forward, paws scraping softly, ribs moving with each cautious breath. The sun dipped lower, the breeze cooling as the air turned purple with dusk. I stayed still, barely breathing, as the dog came close enough to sniff the bread. Its tongue darted out, touching the crust, then pulling back. I didn't move, letting it decide. Finally it lunged forward, snatched the bread, and backed away, chewing quickly, eyes never leaving mine. A small broken laugh escaped my lips, tears burning behind my eyes. "Good boy," I whispered, even though I wasn't sure if it was a boy, even though I didn't know if it would stay. The dog finished the bread, licking its lips, and stood there watching me. I shifted to sit in the dirt, wrapping my arms around my knees again, the rough ground digging into my legs. The dog took a step closer, then another, until it was just a foot away. Close enough for me to see the scars on its muzzle, the dirt caked in its fur. "You're alone too, huh?" I whispered. The dog lowered itself to the ground, laying its head on its paws, eyes blinking slowly as it kept watching me. The air was cooling quickly. Crickets beginning their chorus in the grass, the rustle of wind through the broken boards above us. I didn't know if it would stay. I didn't know if I wanted it to. But the idea of not being alone, even for a night, made the fear in my chest loosen just a little. I leaned back against the house, the wood cold against my spine, and closed my eyes. For a moment, I imagined headlights sweeping over the yard, the sound of gravel under tires, my parents stepping out telling me it was over, that it was just a test. But there was nothing. The darkness grew thicker, the air filled with the sounds of the night. The dog shifted beside me, its breathing slowing, matching mine. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for now we were two creatures left behind, trying to survive one more night. A branch snapped somewhere in the darkness, sharp and close, making the dog lift its head, ears forward, a low growl rumbling in its chest. I held my breath as I looked into the dark yard, the fear crawling back up my spine. Something was moving out there. The dog beside me lifted its head, ears sharp, a low growl rumbling in its throat as the darkness shifted. I held my breath, eyes straining to see past the tree line, the faint rustle of dry grass brushing against the breeze. A raccoon darted out its eyes, catching the moonlight before it scurried back into the trees. The dog's growl faded into a soft whine as it lowered its head again, pressing closer to my leg. "You scared me, Max," I whispered. The name slipped out before I could stop it, but it felt right. Max. His ear twitched at the sound, and I reached out, letting my fingers hover over his dirty fur before touching him. He flinched, then settled, the warmth of his body seeping into the cold night air around us. I leaned back, my hand resting on his neck, feeling the thin skin, the scars hidden beneath matted fur. His ribs moved with each breath, slow and tired, but he didn't move away. For the first time since the truck disappeared, I felt like I wasn't completely alone. "Guess it's you and me now," I said, my voice breaking in the quiet. Max blinked, eyes shining in the moonlight, then closed them again, his breathing deepening as he drifted to sleep. I looked up at the sky, the stars scattered above like cold pinpricks of light, and pulled my knees tighter, listening to the night sounds, letting the fear in my chest settle. Sleep came in waves, pulling me down, letting me drift for a moment before the cold woke me up again. Max stayed close, his body pressed against mine, sharing what little warmth we had as the hours dragged on. When the first hint of dawn turned the sky gray, Max stirred, lifting his head to sniff the air. My stomach ached with hunger, a hollow emptiness that made me dizzy when I stood. I checked my pockets, pulling out 2 crumpled dollar bills and a few coins, not nearly enough, but it was all I had. "Come on," I whispered, nudging Max gently. "We can't stay here." We moved down the dirt road, Max walking close to my side, occasionally bumping into my leg as if to remind me he was there. The world was quiet in the early light, the air cool, the gravel crunching under our feet. We reached the old railroad tracks, the steel cold under my fingers as I used them to steady myself, balancing on the rails for a few steps before dropping back to the dirt. Max sniffed along the edges, finding something small and dead, nudging it before looking back at me, ears low. "I know, buddy," I said, "I'm hungry too." Further down the tracks, we found an apple tree, its branches hanging low over a sagging fence. A few bruised apples lay in the grass, and I grabbed one, wiping the dirt off on my shirt before taking a careful bite. The sweetness filled my mouth, sharp and comforting, and I dropped to sit, letting Max chew on a piece I broke off for him. He ate, quickly licking the juice from his whiskers, then looked up at me with those gold eyes waiting for more. I handed him another piece, the corners of my mouth lifting for the first time in days. We shared 2 apples, and it wasn't enough, but it was something. Max licked my fingers clean, his tail thumping softly against the grass. I ruffled his ears, his fur rough under my hand, and for a moment it almost felt normal. We kept walking, the morning sun warming, the back of my neck drying the dew on the grass as we moved toward the distant sound of cars. I didn't know where we were going, but we couldn't stop, not yet, not here. Max stayed with me, each step matching mine, his head turning with every sound, every car passing on the distant road. We reached a gas station, the pumps old and rusted, the building boarded up, but the outdoor spigot still dripped water. I cupped my hands, letting Max drink first, then splashed the cold water on my face, letting it wake me up. "Ready?" I asked, my voice soft, unsure. Max shook himself, water spraying from his fur, and looked up at me, tail giving a single wag before he stepped forward. We left the tracks and followed the road, Max trotting beside me as the sun climbed higher, the air warming around us and the promise of the next place pulling us forward. Max kept close as we walked, his paws quiet on the warm asphalt, head turning at every bird call and rustle in the grass. My stomach twisted with hunger, the small bites of apple long gone, leaving only the hollow ache that made me dizzy. I kept one hand near Max's back, grounding myself each time he brushed against my leg. We passed broken fences and mailboxes, rusted through the road, quiet except for the soft hum of insects. We reached a crossroads where a single gas station stood, its windows dirty, the open sign unlit. An old vending machine leaned against the wall, the faded colors of soda labels barely visible. I dug into my pocket, pulling out the crumpled bills, and counted the coins in my palm. "Let's hope this works, Max," I muttered. I fed the machine the first dollar, holding my breath as it swallowed the bill with a slow groan. The lights flickered, buttons lighting up in dull red. I pressed for water, praying it would come. With a loud clunk, a bottle dropped, rolling forward. "Yes," I whispered. Max wagged his tail, his tongue, lolling eyes bright with hope. I twisted the cap and poured some into my hand, letting him lap it up, his rough tongue scraping against my skin. I drank the rest, letting the cold water calm the burning dryness in my throat. "Better, huh?" I asked, and Max nudged my hand, licking the last drop from my fingers. We moved on, following the road, until we reached an old railway crossing. Max sniffed around the wooden ties, then jumped when a train horn blew in the distance, the sound echoing across the fields. I watched the sky, the clouds drifting across the blue, and felt the tiredness weighing down on me. "Come on, Max," I said, "let's keep moving." We found a small orchard where fallen apples lay in the grass, bruised but still good enough to eat. I picked a few, wiping them on my jeans before taking small bites, letting Max eat pieces I tore off for him. Juice dripped down my fingers, sticky and sweet, mixing with the dirt on my hands. Max's tail thumped the ground each time he finished a piece, his eyes searching for the next bite. I smiled even if it hurt and gave him another piece, watching him chew carefully, his eyes never leaving mine. "You're a good boy," I said, softly ruffling his ears. When the sun started its slow drop in the sky, painting everything in gold, we walked toward the edge of town. I saw the sign for a diner ahead, its paint peeling, but the smell of cooking drifting through the air, making my stomach clench with longing. Max sniffed the air, whining softly, pulling me forward with gentle tugs of excitement. I looked at the last coins in my hand, not enough for a meal, but maybe enough for a piece of bread or something small. We reached the diner, and I led Max around to the side where a small patch of shade offered a place to rest. I dropped my backpack, letting my legs fold under me as I leaned back against the warm brick wall. Max lay down beside me, head resting on my knee, his eyes watching every movement around us. The smells from the kitchen made my head spin, the sound of plates clinking and laughter drifting through the thin windows. My eyes grew heavy, the exhaustion of the day catching up to me, pulling me toward a restless sleep. Just as I let my head fall back, letting the late afternoon breeze brush over my face, a deep voice cut through the noise. "Hey kid," it said, rough but not unkind. "What are you doing out here all alone?" Max shot up, barking, his fur bristling as he stepped between me and the man. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing Max's collar, my heart thudding so loud I could barely hear. The man stepped back, holding up his hands, palms out, his eyes steady on mine. "Easy kid," he said, his voice rough but calm. "I'm not here to hurt you." Max growled low, his body tense, but he didn't lunge. The man crouched down, slowly pulling something from the pocket of his worn jeans. It was a piece of bread wrapped in a napkin, fresh enough for the smell to reach Max's nose. "You, hungry boy?" the man asked, holding the bread out. Max's growl turned into a whine, his nose twitching as he inched closer. I held his collar tighter, my eyes locked on the man, searching for any sign of danger. His face was lined, a rough beard covering his jaw, but his eyes were a soft gray, tired but kind. "I'm Frank," he said, looking at me, not forcing a smile, just letting the words settle. "Frank Owens. I think I know who you are." My breath caught, fear spiking in my chest. "You don't know me," I said, my voice shaking. Frank nodded, keeping his eyes on Max as he sniffed the bread. "Maybe not well, but I know your dad, Jack. We worked together years ago." Max took a cautious step forward, sniffing the bread, then looking back at me as if asking permission. My stomach twisted at the mention of my dad's name, but Max's eyes were full of hope, and I let go of his collar. "It's okay," I whispered. Max snatched the bread, stepping back to chew quickly, crumbs falling into the dirt. Frank stayed crouched, watching Max, giving me space as I wrapped my arms around myself, the cold of the brick pressing into my back. "How long you been out here, kid?" Frank asked, his voice lower, now less sharp. I didn't answer. I looked away, blinking back, the sting in my eyes as I watched Max finish the bread, licking the crumbs from his whiskers, tail giving a small wag. Frank stood up, slowly pulling another piece of bread from his pocket, holding it out to me. "You look like you could use this too." I hesitated, then reached out, grabbing the bread quickly, holding it to my chest before tearing off a small piece to taste. It was soft, fresh, and I swallowed it down, ignoring the tears that burned in my eyes. "I'm not going to hurt you," Frank said again, softer. "You don't deserve to be out here like this." My shoulders shook, the tears falling before I could stop them, mixing with the dirt on my cheeks. Max pressed against my leg, licking my hand, the warmth of his body grounding me as I cried. Frank didn't move closer, didn't try to touch me. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, letting me fall apart in the safety of the small space behind the diner. When the tears slowed, I wiped my face with the back of my hand, my breathing shaky. Frank finally spoke, his voice steady. "Your dad," he started, then stopped, looking at the sky before meeting my eyes again. "Your dad was never good at being a father. But that doesn't mean you have to pay for it." I swallowed, my voice barely a whisper. "They left me." Frank nodded as if he already knew. "I know, kid. And it's not right." Max sat down, leaning into me, his eyes closing as I scratched behind his ear. Frank watched us for a moment before crouching again, looking me in the eye. "You want a hot meal?" he asked. "A place to clean up, maybe let your dog rest." I opened my mouth, then closed it, the fear and hope tangling in my chest, making it hard to breathe. Frank didn't push. "I won't force you," he said. "But you don't have to keep running, not tonight." I looked at Max, who opened one eye, watching me, waiting. My fingers tightened in his fur, the small weight of hope settling in my chest for the first time in days. Frank stayed quiet, letting the silence settle between us while I wiped my face. Max shifted against my leg, letting out a soft huff as if telling me it was okay to move to trust just this once. Frank glanced at Max, then back at me, his eyes steady but not demanding. "Come inside," he said, nodding toward the diner's back door. "There's warm food and water. You both look like you need it." I looked down at Max, who wagged his tail once, lifting his head, tongue hanging out, waiting for me to decide. My stomach twisted again, reminding me of how empty it was, but my feet felt stuck to the ground. Frank stepped back, opening the door, the warm air drifting out with the smell of fresh coffee and something sweet. Max sniffed the air, whining softly, nudging my leg with his nose. "Okay," I whispered, more to myself than to him. We stepped inside, the door closing softly behind us. The kitchen was small, a single light buzzing above, casting a warm glow over the counters stacked with plates and bowls. A pot of soup simmered on the stove, steam curling into the air. Frank moved around easily, pulling down 2 bowls, filling one with water for Max and the other with thick warm stew. He placed the water on the floor, and Max lunged forward, drinking deeply, tail thumping the ground. Frank handed me the bowl of stew, and the warmth seeped into my cold hands, the smell so good it made my eyes sting again. I sat down on the small step by the back door, Max curling against my side as I lifted the spoon to my lips. The taste was everything I didn't know I needed. Warm, salty, comforting, like something I had only seen in other people's kitchens. I ate in small bites, letting the food calm the ache inside me. Frank leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching me, but not with pity, just a quiet understanding. When I finished, I set the bowl down, wiping my mouth with the back of my hand. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice small. Frank nodded. "No thanks needed, kid." Max finished his water, looking up at Frank, then at me, licking his lips. I scratched behind his ear, feeling him relax, his body warm against my leg. Frank walked over and crouched down, pulling something from his back pocket. It was a worn leather wallet, and from it he pulled out a small faded photo. He held it out to me, and I took it carefully, my breath catching in my throat. It was a picture of me, maybe 8 years old, missing a front tooth, smiling with my arms around a puppy that looked a lot like Max. My dad stood behind me, his hand on my shoulder, his face younger, but the cold look in his eyes was the same. "You kept this?" I asked, my voice shaking. Frank nodded. "Your dad gave it to me years ago, said he wanted to remember the day you stopped crying over everything." I swallowed hard, my fingers gripping the photo. "He said that." Frank's jaw tightened. "Yeah, Jack. He wasn't built to be a father, Harper." I looked down at Max, who was now dozing against my side, trusting me enough to rest. My eyes burned, and I blinked quickly, breathing through the tightness in my chest. Frank took the photo back, sliding it into his wallet, then met my eyes. "You don't deserve what he's done to you." My lips parted, words catching in my throat, but nothing came out. Frank's eyes softened, and he reached out, setting a gentle hand on my shoulder. "You deserve a chance at something better," he said. "A real life. One where you don't have to look over your shoulder every day." I closed my eyes, letting the warmth of his hand sink in, feeling the weight of every moment I had spent alone pressing against me, begging to be let go. When I opened them, Frank was still there, steady, patient, waiting. He stood up slowly, holding out his hand toward me, palm open. "Harper," he said, his voice calm, "are you ready to leave this nightmare behind?" I didn't speak. I just reached out and took Frank's hand. His grip was warm, steady, nothing like the cold hands that had pushed me away so many times before. Max stood shaking out his fur before pressing against my leg, looking up at us as if asking if we were really leaving. "Come on, kid," Frank said, letting go of my hand to open the back door again. "Let's get you both out of here." We walked out into the fading light, the air cool, the sky streaked with pink and gold. Frank led us to his truck, an old blue Ford with dents on the side and a cracked windshield. He opened the passenger door, gesturing for me to climb in. Max jumped in first, curling up on the floor by my feet as I slid into the seat, hugging my backpack to my chest. Frank started the engine, the rumble vibrating through the seat, comforting in its steadiness. He didn't speak as we pulled away from the diner, the tires crunching over gravel before we turned onto the road, leaving the quiet streetlights behind. The ride was long and quiet, the headlights carving out small pieces of the dark road ahead. I kept my hand on Max's back, feeling him breathe, grounding myself with every rise and fall of his chest. Frank hummed softly to the radio, old country songs filling the cab in the pauses between the hum of the tires. We pulled into a small trailer park on the edge of town, the gravel roads lined with old trailers, each with a small porch and a single light glowing at the door. Frank parked in front of a white trailer with blue trim, the paint chipped but the steps swept clean. "This is home for now," Frank said, shutting off the engine. I nodded, opening the door, the cool night air brushing against my face as Max jumped out sniffing the grass before sticking close to my leg. Frank unlocked the door, pushing it open to let the warm light spill out, the scent of coffee and old wood welcoming us in. Inside, the trailer was small but clean. A couch with a faded blanket, a small table with 2 chairs, a tiny kitchen with dishes stacked neatly in the drying rack. It felt safe. "You can take the couch," Frank said, hanging his keys on a hook. "Bathroom's down the hall if you want to clean up." Max jumped onto the couch, curling into a tight ball, his tail thumping once before he settled. I dropped my bag beside him, my hands shaking as I looked around, taking in the small space that felt more like home than anywhere I had been in years. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice catching. Frank nodded, filling a bowl with water for Max and placing it on the floor. Max jumped down, drinking eagerly, the sound filling the small room with something that felt normal. "You both get some rest," Frank said, walking to the small kitchen. "Tomorrow we'll take care of that dog, get him checked out." I glanced at Max, who looked up with water dripping from his chin, his eyes soft and trusting. "And you," Frank continued, leaning against the counter, "we're going to figure out what you need. School, food, whatever it is." I sat down on the couch, the cushions sinking under my weight, Max climbing back up beside me, pressing close until I could feel his warmth along my side. I laid my hand on his back, letting my eyes close, the exhaustion pulling at me now that I was safe. Frank turned off the kitchen light, leaving only the small lamp by the couch on the glow, soft and warm. "Get some sleep, Harper," he said, his voice low. "Tomorrow is a new day." I didn't answer, letting the words settle around me as Max sighed, his body heavy against mine, the soft sounds of the trailer settling into the quiet of the night. I woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Max's paws clicking across the linoleum floor. The morning light slipped through the small window, landing across Max's fur as he wagged his tail, nose pressed to my hand, urging me to get up. I sat up slowly, rubbing sleep from my eyes, the blanket slipping from my shoulders. Frank stood at the stove, a mug in his hand, his eyes meeting mine with a quiet nod. "Morning, Harper." I cleared my throat, my voice rough. "Morning." Max pressed his head into my lap, eyes hopeful, tail thumping. I scratched behind his ears, feeling the warmth of him, letting it chase away the cold that still clung to my chest. "Eat first," Frank said, sliding a plate with scrambled eggs and toast onto the small table. "Then we're taking Max to get checked out." Max lifted his head, ears perked at the sound of his name, and I almost smiled. After breakfast, we loaded into Frank's truck, Max sitting between us, his head turning with each sound outside the window. The vet clinic was small, the bell above the door jingling as we stepped inside. The smell of antiseptic mixed with the soft barks and meows drifting from the back. Max tensed, pressing against my leg, but I kept a hand on his neck, whispering, "It's okay, buddy." The vet, a kind woman with gray hair pulled back in a braid, knelt in front of Max, letting him sniff her hand before scratching under his chin. "He's a good boy," she said, smiling at me. Max got his shots, flinching but not pulling away his eyes on me the whole time. Frank filled out some paperwork, glancing back at me as I held Max's head in my hands, whispering, "Good job, Max." Back in the truck, Max curled up on the seat, tired but safe, his head resting on my thigh. Frank started the engine, glancing at me. "You did good." We drove into town, stopping in front of a large brick building with glass doors. A sign above read Community Technology Center. Frank looked at me, waiting. "What is this?" I asked, my fingers tightening around Max's fur. Frank smiled, just a small curve of his lips. "A place to see what's possible." Inside, the room was filled with tables covered in circuit boards, laptops, and small robots rolling across the floor. College students in hoodies and jeans moved between stations, testing code, laughing, arguing, their voices a hum of energy. I stood frozen, eyes wide, watching a girl with curly hair program a small robot to follow a black line on the floor. Another group adjusted sensors on a drone, the tiny propellers buzzing softly. Frank leaned down, his voice low. "You like this stuff, don't you?" I nodded, unable to speak as the robot changed direction, lights blinking following the girl's command. Frank placed a hand on my shoulder steady. If you wanted Harper, we can make this happen. GED scholarships a real shot. Fear tightened in my chest, the doubt creeping in like a shadow. I'm not smart enough, I whispered. I don't have money. Frank's grip on my shoulder tightened, not hard, but enough to make me look up. You're smart enough. You're worth this. Don't let what they did to you make you forget that. The students' laughter drifted around us, the sound of the robot's wheels clicking against the floor, the low hum of computers filling the air. I watched the girl raise her arms in victory as the robot reached the finish line, her friends cheering. For a moment, I let myself imagine it. Learning, building, being part of something that wasn't survival but hope. Max pressed his nose against my leg, letting out a soft whine, reminding me he was there, reminding me I wasn't alone. I looked at Frank, his eyes waiting patient. I nodded just once, letting the fear and hope battle inside me. That night, I sat on the couch with Max's head on my lap, my GED prep books stacked on the table, pages marked with sticky notes. Frank was in the kitchen humming as he cleaned up, the warm light of the trailer steady around us. My phone buzzed on the table, the screen lighting up with a number I knew too well. A message popped up. Maya, don't forget you're still our daughter. I stared at the message, the glow of the screen lighting up Max's gray fur as he lifted his head. He let out a soft huff, resting his chin back on my leg as if telling me not to let it get to me. I turned the phone over, letting the screen go dark, letting the past slip back into the shadows where it belonged. Years passed like that. I got my GED, then a scholarship. Frank was there for every milestone, standing in the back of the graduation hall when I walked across the stage, clapping with quiet pride. Max waited at home, tail thumping when I opened the door, licking tears off my face when I finally let myself cry. I got into MIT, terrified I would fail, certain I didn't belong. But I stayed. I learned to build algorithms, code late into the night, and present research I never thought I could understand. Max lay under my desk, growing older, his muzzle going white, but his eyes still following me as I paced during late-night calls. When I graduated, I moved to Austin, the heat familiar, but the city alive with something I had never felt before: possibility. I launched Cypress Systems, building AI to help doctors detect diseases faster, giving people a chance I wished someone had given me. We grew fast. Investors came, contracts were signed, and offices filled with the low hum of computers and the soft chatter of engineers. Max's bed stayed beside my glass desk, the soft thump of his tail, the only sound that could break my focus when the world outside got too loud. One morning, I was reviewing a new pitch deck when Jenny, my assistant, knocked on the glass door, her eyes uneasy. "There's someone here to see you," she said carefully. Before I could ask, the door swung open. My mother stepped in first, wearing a pale pink blouse, her hair curled, her smile tight and practiced. My father followed, older, heavier, but his eyes sharp, scanning the room like he was looking for something to own. And behind them was Blake. His hair was longer, his shirt wrinkled, the scent of cheap cologne and cigarettes clinging to him as he smirked at the polished floors and the awards lining the walls. "Wow," Blake said, letting out a low whistle. "You really made it, huh?" I stood up slowly, the distance between me and them feeling like miles even in that small office. Max lifted his head, letting out a low growl before settling back down, his eyes fixed on Blake. "Why are you here?" I asked, my voice calm, the steel in it even surprising me. My mother's smile cracked. "Maya, honey, we're family. We just wanted to see you." Blake scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Cut it out, Mom." My father stepped forward, his hands in his pockets. "We're in a bit of trouble, kid. Times are tough." Blake's smirk twisted into something meaner. "You owe us, Maya." I let out a breath, my fingers curling against the edge of my desk. "I don't owe you anything." Blake stepped closer, slamming his hand down, making Max stand, teeth bared, a low growl in his throat. "You think you're better than us now," Blake spat. "You think you can just take Frank, take everything, and leave us to rot." My mother's eyes flashed, her voice sharp. "We are your family. You owe us respect." I met her eyes steady. "Respect is earned." Blake's hand curled into a fist, but my father grabbed his arm, pulling him back. The room was silent except for Max's low growl and the hum of the AC. "We need your help," my father said, his voice lower, but the command in it was clear. I shook my head, stepping back. "Number Blake's face turned red, his teeth grinding. You owe us, Maya. You owe me. I picked up Max's leash, clipping it to his collar, ignoring the way my mother's eyes followed every movement. Get out, I said, my voice cold. My mother's eyes narrowed, the sweetness gone. You'll regret this. I opened the door, waiting. One by one they left, my mother's perfume lingering in the air, long after the door clicked shut. Max pressed against my leg, his body warm, his eyes asking if it was over. But I knew it wasn't. I locked the door, leaning my forehead against the cold glass, letting out a breath I didn't know I was holding. Max sat down beside me, his eyes following every small movement, waiting, guarding. I sank down next to him, resting my hand on his back, feeling the soft rise and fall of his breathing. They won't stop, I whispered. Max nudged my hand, pressing his head into my palm, reminding me I wasn't alone, not anymore. I closed my eyes, letting the steady hum of the office lights and the quiet click of the AC settle the storm building in my chest. That night I stayed late at Cypress Systems, the glow of the city lights outside, blending with the screens lighting up the office. Max lay under my desk, his head resting on his paws, his eyes half closed but always watching. Emails buzzed in meetings, scheduled investors to reassure, projects to approve. I moved through it all with practiced ease, but under it a quiet tension throbbed, warning me that the past was clawing its way back. Frank called as I packed up to leave, his voice warm, steady. Heard they showed up, he said. I let out a tired laugh. Yeah. You okay? Frank asked, the silence on the line letting me know he would wait for the truth. I will be, I said softly. Frank was quiet, then cleared his throat. They see what you've built, Maya. That's why they're here. I looked around the office, the awards, the projects in progress, the dream that had once felt impossible now alive around me. They're not taking it, I said, my voice firm. Damn right, Frank replied, and I could hear the pride in his voice before he hung up. I drove home that night, the Austin skyline glowing in the distance, Max's head resting on the back seat, his eyes watching the lights pass by. We pulled into the small house I had bought, the porch lights spilling warm yellow onto the driveway. Inside, Max went to his bed by the fireplace, circling before settling down with a soft sigh. I stood in the kitchen drinking water, letting the quiet wrap around me, reminding myself how hard I had fought for this peace. But peace didn't last. 2 days later, Jenny knocked on my office door, her face pale, her phone in her hand. You need to see this, she said, her voice shaking. She handed me the phone, and my stomach dropped. Social media notifications exploded on the screen, hundreds of messages flooding the company's page, my personal accounts, investor emails. CEO ungrateful to her dying parents. She stole from her family to build her company. Blood money built on betrayal. I scrolled, my pulse pounding, the words blurring together as photo after photo loaded pictures of me at MIT at the Cypress launch, standing beside Frank, my parents smiling in old family photos posted beside claims that I had abandoned them. Max stood walking over, pressing his head against my leg, grounding me as my hands shook. Who's posting these? Jenny whispered. I looked at her, my jaw tightening. Them. She swallowed, glancing at the screen again. What do we do? I turned the phone over, the screen going dark, my reflection staring back at me. They want a war, I said, my voice calm, cold. Max let out a low growl, his eyes sharp, as if he understood. Then we'll give them one. The notifications didn't stop, a constant buzzing that filled the office and my home even in the dead of night. Blake had created a Facebook group, his face front and center, in every video, claiming I had stolen from my dying parents, calling me a cold-hearted thief who left them to starve while I built my empire. Behind him, my mother sobbed on Livestreams, tissues clutched in her shaking hands as she told strangers how I abandoned them. My father sat beside her, shaking his head, muttering about ungrateful children and family betrayal. The comments flooded in. She's a monster. Money changes people. Someone needs to stop her. I watched as contracts slipped away, emails from investors asking for clarification, the silence that followed after I sent explanations no one wanted to read. Employees whispered when I walked by, their eyes darting away, the tension in the hallways thick enough to choke on. Then the tabloids picked it up. CEO's family betrayal, a daughter's cold goodbye. Clickbait headlines, stolen photos from my college years, blurry images of my parents' tear-streaked faces, and lies that were easier to believe than the truth. Max grew sicker, his breathing ragged, every step slower, his eyes still following me with quiet loyalty even as pain clouded them. I spent nights sleeping on the floor next to him, listening to his soft whimpers, counting each breath. One morning, as I carried Max to the car, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I balanced him carefully, one arm around his frail body, and swiped to see David's message. "They're threatening to sue," it read. "They want a portion of your company assets, claiming you owe them for raising you." My vision blurred, the morning light too bright, the weight of Max heavier than I could bear. I kissed the top of his head, whispering, "Hang on, buddy," as I closed the car door and drove to the vet. The clinic smelled like antiseptic, and fear, the quiet hum of machines and soft voices in the back rooms. I held Max's paw as the vet examined him, the words complications and pain management echoing in my ears, each one a crack in the dam holding back my tears. Frank showed up that evening, letting himself in with the spare key, carrying 2 bags of takeout we wouldn't eat. He sat next to me on the floor where Max lay on a blanket, his breathing shallow, his eyes closing and opening slowly. Frank's hand found mine, rough and warm, steady as it had always been. "You've been quiet long enough, Maya," he said, his voice low. I shook my head, wiping tears that kept coming no matter how hard I tried to stop them. "They're trying to destroy everything. They're trying to take everything." Frank squeezed my hand, his eyes on Max, who let out a soft sigh, shifting closer to me. "Then don't let them." I looked at Max, at the dog who had followed me through every storm, who had waited for me at the door through every late night, who had never once doubted me when the world did. His chest rose and fell each breath, a battle, each blink slower than the last, but his eyes still found mine, trusting. "I can't let them take this." "Max," I whispered, my hand on his head, my tears falling onto his fur. Max let out a low huff, his tail tapping weakly against the blanket. Frank's hand rested on my shoulder, firm, grounding. "Then it's time." I wiped my eyes, standing slowly, looking at the reflection of myself in the dark window. My face was tired, but my eyes were clear. I walked to the kitchen table, pulling my laptop from its case, the weight of it familiar, comforting. I opened it, the screen lighting up the room, illuminating Max's quiet breathing, Frank's steady presence, and the storm that was waiting outside. My fingers hovered over the keyboard before I began to type. STREAMTITLE, the truth. My hands shook as I adjusted the webcam, the faint hum of the laptop fan the only sound. Frank sat on the edge of the couch, his elbows on his knees, watching me without a word. Max lay beside him, his breathing labored, but his eyes opened, finding me, holding me steady. I clicked go live. The screen flashed, the red light blinking, the viewer count climbing from 5 to 50 to over 100 in seconds. Comments started flooding in a stream of angry words, questions, accusations. I took a deep breath. "My name is Maya Holloway." I began, my voice low, steady. "And this is the truth." I could see my reflection in the small camera window, the dark circles under my eyes, the exhaustion, the pain. But I didn't look away. "You've seen the videos. The stories. You've heard my parents, my brother telling you I abandoned them, stole from them, left them to suffer while I built my life." My throat tightened, but I pushed through, my hands gripping the edges of the laptop. "They didn't tell you about the day they left me at a rotting house when I was 16. About how they drove away laughing, calling it a lesson. About how I spent years fighting to survive while they ignored me, while they told me I was worthless." Frank shifted his eyes on me, nodding, reminding me I wasn't alone. "They didn't tell you about Frank, who found me, who gave me a place to stay, who helped me get my GED, who sat in the back row at my MIT graduation because he knew no one else would come." I paused, the viewer count climbing, the comments slowing, people listening. "They didn't tell you about the nights I spent building this company, about the people we've helped, the families we've saved with our work. About Max," I glanced at him, my voice cracking, "who stayed by my side every step, who never let me feel alone." I wiped a tear that slipped down my cheek, breathing hard. "They want to take it all. They want to destroy everything because they think I owe them something." I leaned closer to the camera, my eyes locking onto the lens. "I don't owe them my life." The comments exploded, but I ignored them, the weight in my chest loosening as the truth spilled out piece by piece. They want you to believe I am a monster, I said softly, but I'm just someone who survived. Max let out a low, tired whine, and I reached down, resting my hand on his head, feeling the soft warmth, the loyalty that never wavered. Frank stood, placing a hand on my shoulder, grounding me. They won't take this from me, I whispered, more to Max than to the camera, but I knew they could hear me. I ended the stream, the screen going black, the reflection of myself, staring back, tired but unbroken. The room was silent, the hum of the city outside, muffled by the closed windows. Then, in the quiet, my phone buzzed, lighting up with a message from an unknown number. You think this is over? It's just beginning. I stared at the message, my thumb hovering over the screen as Max shifted beside me. Frank watched quietly, his arms crossed, his eyes waiting calm. I took a slow breath, locking my phone and setting it face down on the table. They think they can scare me, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Frank nodded. They don't know you. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by Max's bed, his breathing slow, his eyes fluttering open every so often to find me, to remind me that he was still here. I opened my laptop, the glow lighting up the dark room, and began to write. Every word, every memory, every scar they left behind, I laid it bare. I told them about the day they left me at the abandoned house, the smell of rot and fear thick in the air as I waited for parents who never came back. I told them about every lesson they taught me, the nights I spent outside in storms, the mornings I walked miles in the rain, the way my name felt like an insult in their mouths. I told them about Frank, about the day he found me, the day he gave me food, shelter, and the first moment I felt safe in years. I told them about Max, the stray who chose me, who followed me through every hard day, who laid by my side through every long night of studying, coding, building. I told them about MIT, the fear of not being enough, the exhaustion, the victories that felt small until they weren't. I told them about Cyprus, about the lives we saved, the work we did, the team that became my family when I had none. I told them everything. When the sun rose, I hit upload. The video went live, and for a moment I was terrified. I stood by the window watching the dawn creep across the sky, Max pressing against my leg, warm and constant. Then the views climbed. Comments poured in. I believe you. You are so strong. They don't deserve you. Number. Stand with Maya trended within hours. People sharing my story, people telling their own people, standing up when they once stayed silent. Emails came in from investors, short but steady. We believe in you. Your work matters. You have our support. Clients returned, contracts re-signed, and the hum of the office returned, louder, stronger, a promise that the storm wouldn't wash us away. I checked social media once, only once, to see the fallout. Blake's friends turning on him, calling him a liar, a leech. My parents' neighbors posting videos, shaking their heads, calling them out for what they did, for what they tried to destroy. They had lost their power, and the silence that followed was not empty but peaceful. I sat in the quiet of my office, Max's head on my foot, the light from the setting sun painting the room gold. For the first time in years, the air felt clear, the heaviness lifting from my shoulders. I closed my eyes, letting the moment wash over me, letting it sink into the parts of me that had once been too broken to hope. Then my phone buzzed again. Blake's name lit up on the screen, his words sharp, bitter. You'll regret this. You made us lose everything. I stared at the message, the light of the screen reflecting in the window, the promise of another battle waiting. I set the phone down, pressing my palms to the cool surface of the desk as the words sank into the quiet. Max shifted beside me, letting out a tired breath, his body curled tightly, the tip of his tail flicking once before it stilled. The city lights outside blinked, each one a reminder that the world was still moving even as the past tried to drag me back. Frank stepped into the office, the door clicking softly behind him. He carried 2 mugs, the steam rising in thin threads into the dim light. Thought you could use this, he said, setting the coffee down near my hand. Thanks, I murmured, wrapping my fingers around the warmth, letting it ground me, letting the scent of coffee push away the metallic taste of fear that tried to climb into my throat. Frank lowered himself into the chair across from me, his elbows resting on his knees, his eyes never leaving mine. He didn't ask what the message said. He didn't have to. They think it's over, I said, my voice low. They think they can threaten me again. Frank nodded, the lines around his eyes tightening as he watched me. They're scared, Maya. Because you stood up. I looked away, my eyes catching on the framed photo on the shelf. Me and Max 3 years ago standing outside the Cypress building on opening day. My smile had been real then, the future wide open, untouched by the storm that would come. I swallowed, blinking back the sting in my eyes. I thought it would feel different, I admitted. Telling the truth. I thought it would feel like winning. It does, Frank said quietly. It just doesn't feel like it yet. The notifications on my laptop blinked, soft pings breaking the silence. I clicked open the messages one after another. Investors reaffirming their contracts. Clients thanking us for staying open. Strangers writing paragraphs sharing how the Livestream gave them courage to speak up about their own families, their own pain. Number, stand with Maya. Trending, the words repeated under images of me speaking of Max resting beside me, of the small office that had become the heart of a battle I never wanted. I scrolled each message, adding weight and lightness at the same time, a paradox I wasn't ready to name. My hand dropped to Max's head, scratching behind his ear, feeling the warmth, the steady presence that never faltered. Frank stood, moving to the window, looking out over Austin's glowing streets. You've done something most people never could, he said, his reflection, a quiet shadow against the glass. You've told the truth and lived. I turned in my chair, watching him. They're going to keep coming, Frank. He glanced back, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Let them. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt earned. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm, when the world is still wet but the air feels clearer. Max let out a soft huff, shifting his eyes, meeting mine, tired but calm. I knelt down, pressing my forehead to his, letting the moment anchor me. You did good, buddy, I whispered. You did so good. His tail thumped once, the soft sound louder in the quiet room than any threat Blake could send. Frank turned back, leaning against the edge of the desk, his eyes on me, on Max, on the laptop that still glowed with messages of hope and rage and support. They can't take this from you, Maya, he said. I stood, my legs stiff, my shoulders heavy but steady. I looked around the office, the whiteboards filled with plans, the notes stuck to screens, the small cactus on the windowsill I kept forgetting to water. This was mine. Ours. And they would not take it. The last notification caught my eye, a message from a woman I didn't know. You're not alone. I closed my eyes, letting the words settle, letting them push away Blake's threats, letting them replace the fear with something softer, something stronger. I opened my eyes to the glow of the city, the soft breathing of Max, the quiet pride in Frank's gaze. For the first time, the quiet wasn't empty. It was freedom. Then my phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up in the dark, and I saw Blake's name flash across it, the words waiting, pulsing, a promise that this battle was not over yet. I let the phone ring, the screen lighting up the dark room, then going dark again. Max shifted, letting out a soft groan, his head pressing against my foot as if telling me it was okay to let it go. I reached down, running my hand over his soft fur, feeling how thin he had gotten, how every breath was slower, now heavier. Outside, the city was alive, the glow of Austin wrapping around the windows, the soft hum of cars below mixing with the rustle of wind through the trees. I stood, moving to the window, pressing my hand against the glass, watching the lights blink, reminding me that life kept moving forward. Frank found me there a few minutes later, a blanket in his hands, draping it over my shoulders without saying a word. We stood together, the silence stretching, but it wasn't heavy. It was the kind that felt like breathing. They're gone, Frank finally said, his voice low. They packed up. Left the city. Word is they're trying to escape their debts. I nodded, the tension easing from my shoulders, the fear loosening its grip. Good. Frank looked at me, his eyes tired but warm. They can't hurt you anymore. I turned away from the window, letting out a breath I had been holding for years. Max wagged his tail weakly, trying to stand, but I knelt down, holding him close, feeling the warmth of him, the quiet strength that had carried me through every dark day. It's okay, buddy, I whispered, pressing my forehead to his. You can rest now. His eyes met mine, soft, trusting, before they fluttered closed, his breathing, slowing, his tail tapping once against the floor. I held him as the last breath, left him, tears streaming down my face, my chest aching, but underneath the pain was something gentle. Gratitude. For every mile he walked beside me. For every night he kept me from feeling alone. For every moment he reminded me what love was supposed to feel like. Frank sat beside us, his hand on my shoulder, letting me grieve, letting me hold on until I was ready to let go. When I finally stood, the city was quiet, the dawn just starting to break, painting the sky in soft pinks and golds. I wrapped Max in the blanket, carrying him to the small patch of earth I had chosen under the oak tree in the backyard. Frank helped me, his hands steady, his silence comforting as we lowered Max into the ground, the morning light washing over us, a soft breeze rustling the leaves above. I placed his favorite toy beside him, the worn-out rope he used to tug at, the one that had survived every move, every late-night coding session, every storm. "Thank you," I whispered, pressing my hand into the fresh earth. Frank placed a hand on my back. "You saved him, Maya. And he saved you." I nodded, wiping my tears, letting the morning air fill my lungs, letting the warmth of the sun touch my face. We walked back inside the quiet house, no longer feeling empty but peaceful. I sat at the kitchen table, the coffee warm in my hands, the silence wrapping around me like a promise. Frank stood by the door, turning before he left, his eyes meeting mine. "You saved yourself, kid. Don't forget that." I smiled, small but real. "Thank you, Frank." He nodded, leaving the door open just a crack, letting the morning breeze drift and letting the light fill the room. I stood there for a moment, letting the morning air wash over me, breathing in the quiet. I moved through the house, slowly touching the back of the couch where Max used to sleep, running my fingers along the kitchen counter where Frank would leave coffee, letting each corner remind me how far I had come. I stepped into Max's corner where his bed still lay, the blanket neatly folded, his old rope toy resting on top. I picked it up, feeling the frayed edges between my fingers, closing my eyes as I remembered the way he used to tug at it, his tail wagging, his eyes bright, reminding me to laugh, reminding me to live. The sunlight crept further into the room, touching the photos on the shelves, the awards I once thought would mean everything, the framed snapshot of me at MIT with Frank in the background grinning with pride. I took it down, holding it close to my chest. Frank came by later that morning, knocking softly before letting himself in, holding a brown paper bag of groceries in one hand, a quiet smile on his face. "You don't have to keep checking on me," I said, a small smile pulling at my lips. "I know," he replied, setting the bag down, pulling out a carton of eggs and a loaf of bread. "But I want to." We made breakfast together, moving around each other in the kitchen, the quiet companionship comforting, grounding. I poured us coffee and we sat at the table, the soft morning light falling over us as we ate. "You've come a long way, Maya," Frank said, his eyes warm, his voice steady. "I couldn't have done it without you," I said, looking at him. Frank shook his head, a small chuckle escaping his lips. I swallowed the truth of his words, sinking in soft but heavy, like the way dawn feels before the sun fully rises. After he left, I packed up the last of Max's things, placing the box gently in the hall closet, pressing my hand against it for a moment, letting the grief come but letting it pass too, like a wave I no longer feared would drown me. I drove to the small office downtown, the one I had rented for the Max Foundation, unlocking the door and stepping into the quiet space that smelled like fresh paint and hope. The walls were lined with shelves of donated books, boxes of clothes for girls who needed them, laptops, waiting for hands that would learn to build futures with them. I walked to the window, looking out at the city, at the people moving along the sidewalks, at the buses rumbling past, at the mothers holding their daughters' hands as they crossed the street. A knock came at the door and I turned to see a young girl, barely 17, standing there with a backpack slung over one shoulder, her eyes wary, her hands fidgeting. "Hi," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "They told me, you help girls like me." I smiled, stepping forward, holding the door open wider. "Yes," I said. "Come in." She stepped inside, looking around, her eyes landing on the bookshelf, the chairs, the plants on the windowsill. Her shoulders dropped just a little, the tension in her jaw loosening. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching the strap of her backpack. "You're safe here," I said, guiding her to a chair. I sat with her, listening to her story, hearing the pain, the fear, the loneliness I once knew too well. I offered her food, a warm drink, a place to rest, a path forward. And as I watched her take a sip of tea, her hands trembling, her eyes filling with tears, she tried to blink away. I felt Max beside me, felt Frank's steady hand on my shoulder, felt the warmth of a life I had fought to build. That evening, I stood on my balcony, the wind moving through my hair, the lights of Austin glowing below, the world alive and waiting. I took a sip of wine, letting the warmth settle in my chest, letting the peace wrap around me, letting the fear go, letting the guilt dissolve. I had chosen myself. And I was free. What would you have done if you were me?